And welcome everybody to another episode of the Most Important Conversations. I'm here with my co-host September. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Ted. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. So great to see you again. And I'm excited about today's topic, actually. It's something that happened very organically and in terms of our conversations and what had come up with our team in TMIC. And then suddenly we thought, oh, wow, this would be a really great podcast. So we're talking today, everybody, about the ego and how the ego is a very, very, I don't know what the word is. It's a very subtle thing that kind of just creeps up on you. And even when you don't think you're in it, and it's often a misunderstood thing too. What we often think about ego is not what it actually is. But September, why don't you kind of lead us into kind of how we got to this point of conversation and what made you want to kind of delve into it?
Well, the awareness of the different ways that ego can show up had been opened in my mind this past week in various conversations that you and I have been having, and you and I and the team have been having around ego. And it was just a humongous aha to know that ego wears different faces. It shows up and it's very sneaky. The ego part, it sneaks up on you, creeps up on you, it sneaks up on you. It's so subtle, we don't know that it's there until we know that it's there. And what was a big awareness for me around the ego is that ego doesn't always have to be what we consider egotistical, cocky, arrogant, full of himself, narcissistic. That's what typically when I think of ego, that's where I want to go. And I think most people go there naturally. But there's another version of ego. And the way that you explained it to me was that ego is really just holding to an identity of something, holding to the identity that I'm the GOAT, right? I'm the greatest of all time. I'm the best. I know what I'm doing. I've got it all. That can be ego. Then ego can also be, well, I don't want to ask too much. I want to show up as understanding, and I want to show up as caring, and I want to show up as if I have empathy for where that person is, and I don't want to ask too much of people. So I'm just gonna the people pleasing, right? People pleasing, trying to be liked by everybody. That can also be ego in the way that it's showing up. As a leader, and that's really where the tipping point was for me, was around the conversation of leadership. That as a leader, it's our job to hold the vision. And as you say, be a steward of that vision. Put the vision in front energetically, and we're behind it, pushing the vision forward and encouraging the team to push that vision forward as well. But sometimes as leaders, we don't want to ask too much of our team. I know I've been in that place before. I've been called out by it, by some of my team members, not in the sense of your ego's getting in the way, but you're not allowing us to do more. Because I would take it. Oh, I don't want you to do more. You already do too much. I'll just add it to my plate. That's ego. And when I had that awareness, when you had, we were talking about that and you said that, it was such a wow, does that put leadership in the right perspective for me? It was huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you think about leaders, so what happened, everyone, was I had this moment where I realized I'd gone away to Hawaii for a little couple weeks vacation. And so I was able to kind of reflect on all of the work that we're doing with TMIC and the different projects that we're doing with our workshops and the design summits and all of the things that we're preparing for and excited about, and for 2024. And there were some things that we were working on that were really kind of taking longer than they needed to, and a lot of that was falling on my shoulders because people were asking me to look at this or look at that and provide feedback. And not that that's an issue, but I was doing that while at the same time handling all of the other things that I'm doing for the different projects and initiatives. And instead of demanding more from the team, I just took it all on, and it became a situation where I was bogging things down and slowing things down. And it wasn't until I stepped away and took a look back at it, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is how the ego shows up. It showed up not wanting to be a demand on the people on the team inside of the TMIC team, because I'm just, always so grateful that everyone's there and we're so aligned with the vision and the mission of what we're doing. And I thought, well, I need to, carry the majority of the weight here, in order to kind of lead this forward. But that's the opposite of actually what really strong leadership is. Now, a lot of people will say things that, like, leadership is all about delegating, and that's the active part of what you need to do. But there's something that comes before being able to delegate effectively, and that is checking your ego at the door. Because the ego can show up, like you were just saying, September. The obvious way we're used to thinking about it is, that big, bombastic, bloviating, like you said, egotistical kind of person or personality. But that's not the only way ego shows up. Like you said, it shows up in whenever we're putting, it can show up when we're not wanting to require things of people. We're wanting to please people. We're wanting to make sure that we don't, offend people. That's actually ego. Can you imagine? Not wanting to offend someone is actually you're in your ego. Okay, so why is this the case? The ego is only identity. And so whenever we're putting our identity, who we think the mask that we wear, who we think we want to be, or who we think we want to, what we think we want to project, whenever we're putting that identity ahead of our calling, our purpose, the thing that we are the steward of in our life. In the case of TMIC, it's TMIC is the result of not my idea, but an idea looking for birth in the world. And so my job is really just to be the steward of that vision. And the vision requires certain things to happen in order to fulfill it. Basic things sometimes, like marketing and websites and social media and, things like that, producing content so that we can actually reach people and engage with people. So there's things that need to be required. And my identity got in the way of not wanting to be too much of a demand or ask too much of the team. And so I took that on because I had in my mind this identity of, I have to do it all. Well, that's ego. Even though you could say, well, you were trying to be respectful of people's time and you were trying to be respectful of, the level of effort and energy that they're putting into something. And so you're wanting to not demand too much of them. But that's where the ego got in the way, because it's not me that was demanding it. The vision demands that certain things happen at a certain time. And if I'm being the gridlock, those things aren't happening. Therefore, the ego is getting in the way. And so to just frame it another way, if you find yourself people pleasing, not wanting to offend people, you're not, one of the things we teach in TMIC is emotional sobriety. None of us are responsible for someone else's emotion. So if we're like not speaking our truth, we're not telling the truth as we see it because we're afraid that someone else might be offended, what we're really doing is letting our ego get in the way, because we're not responsible for whether or not someone is offended. They're responsible for their emotions. We're responsible for ours. And so again, you can see how it's quite egotistical to think that I can control someone else's emotions, that I could actually be so powerful and responsible for their emotional state that I'm going to angle and change and not say what needs to be said. And so this is how ego can be, identity. When you think of ego, just think of identity.
So you said something a minute ago about my identity got into the way. And I think the clarity around that is to say that my need to hold on to that identity got into the way. And because going back to self-awareness, having that level of self-awareness to know that that is not who you are, that may be how you like to treat people. It may be a level of respect that you have for people, but then I think it gets convoluted and we kind of get it all twisted up inside. It's just an awareness of, I like to treat people with respect, and I like to respect their time and not ask for things that are inappropriate or too demanding of what was agreed upon or something like that. To me, that's respect. But then allowing yourself to make a decision from that space of, well, I want to hold on to this way of being seen in my relationships. In order to do that, this is the action that I need to take. I'll take it on myself, and holding on to that identity. And I just want to make a note here on definition. I'm real big about looking up words and understanding the literal definition. So we're typically know ego as a noun, which is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. That's where the boasting of yourself comes into play. However, when we look at ego from a psychoanalysis definition, it says the part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. So we're not taught, like, we were just having this conversation about our education system, which is another conversation that we definitely need to have. We're not taught the different ways that words can be used. And so we're only taught this narrow-minded definition around a lot of words growing up. And that's the lens that we look through. That's the judgment that we have of people. Oh, you're being egotistical. Oh, that guy's so full of himself. Well, okay, maybe, but what's underneath of that? Right? Why is he behaving that way? What identity is he trying to hold on to? I don't want people to see my flaws, so therefore I'm going to show up as if I am the greatest of all time, right? And nobody's going to be able to see any of my flaws because I'm going to hold that identity that I am the best.
Yeah, and what's under all of that is someone who hasn't come to a place of total peace and acceptance with who they are. And so they're trying to project something out into the world. And in a way, when we get so attached to, like, I don't believe that ego disillusion, you hear this often in a lot of spiritual communities and transformational or self-help communities, that ego disillusion, this idea that we can actually get rid of our ego, get rid of our identity, is actually a thing that we can attain for any meaningful length of time. Now it's something to understand and have awareness around and develop some level of mastery around. That's really what there is to do about it. Years ago, like Ram Dass has given great talks on this. He says, the way he phrased it, used to phrase it, was that, we spend our whole lives, and he actually, his analogy for our ego was spacesuits. He said, it's kind of like we're wearing a spacesuit and we're all wearing different spacesuits. And, we're wearing these spacesuits because we want to be somebody. So our spacesuits are supposed to be like an outward exemplification of the somebody that we are committed to being. And so he said, it's so crazy when you think about it, because it's like we're walking down the street and I'm in my spacesuit and you're in your spacesuit, and it's not who we really are. It's the spacesuit, and that's what we're seeing. And so it's like, oh wow, what a nice spacesuit you got. Yeah, yours is pretty good too. Like, and we're not actually talking to each other. We're talking between spacesuits. So it's that identity piece. And so he gave so many talks over the years about the power of becoming nobody, because we've spent most of our lives trying to become a somebody. Mm-hmm. Yes. But the somebody, the true somebody that you are, is your true authentic self. And the only way to get to that is to first become a nobody, and then to be able to create that somebody from your deepest understanding and alignment of your ultimate calling or purpose or intention for who you are, and to come from that place. Of course, most of us never had the opportunity when we were 7 or 8 or 12 or whatever to tune into who that authentic person really was. Most of us are trapped in the conditioning from our youth and what we've learned from our friends, family, and community. And so we learn how to become, how to let the ego drive, and how to be quote unquote egotistical. Yeah. And but I think the important thing that we want to get across today is that the ego is identity, is the way to think about it. And not everyone will have the identity of a bombastic, loud, rude, arrogant personality. Not everyone has that. But that doesn't mean that just because you're not behaving that way that you don't have an ego. Every human being has an ego. The ego can show up in the most subtle, ways, to the point where someone can be completely self-deprecating and putting other people first all the time. And that can actually be one of the most egotistical people you've ever met. And you'd be like, what? They're so kind. They're so gentle. What do you mean egotistical? But it's egotistical because they're depriving and denying themselves and others from their true authentic self, And how do you know if it's going on? Well, he'll have chatter going on in your mind, right? Well, look how much I do for them. And, I'm always considerate.
Nobody appreciates me.
No one appreciates, what are you complaining about? I always talk about how complaint is such a powerful insight into what's going on. If you have no complaints, you're probably operating from a more pure place. Now, you could be really effective at repressing the complaints in your mind. So you have to look at that too, right?
Yeah.
But if you can truly get to a place where you're at peace and you're content and there's nothing going on in terms of that mind chatter or complaining, then in those moments, you're probably being your authentic self. But look at where you're complaining, because if you're complaining about stuff, there's ego all around that. There's identity all around that.
So when you were saying this idea of being nothing on a spiritual soul level, if I separate myself from my physical part of me and just feel me as a spirit, as a being, yes, totally makes sense. The moment it hits the physical aspect of me, it feels like a total personal affront to my existence. What do you mean I am nothing? But however, that going back into the ego conversation is that self-awareness. Where are you coming from? And then around that, I think we can also find complaints around it, such as, what do you mean I'm nothing? I do this and I do that. And listing out all the things that we do as humans. Something that you mentioned a moment ago that it brought up a question for me that I'm curious to hear what you have to say. We were talking about that boastful, egotistical personality, and that typically what's underneath of that, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, what's underneath of that is that there's just a lack of peace with who they really are, something that you have said. Let's flip the coin and take a personality that's the people-pleasing personality that lives in ego from the people-pleasing perspective. Are they also not at peace with who they are? And they just express that in a kinder, gentler, people-pleasing way, as where the other person is just expressing it in more of aggressive, boastful, in-your-face kind of way?
Well, yeah, because go to the source of both of those. And the source of both of those is going to be some version or variation of I'm not good enough. See, if you understand who you authentically are and you accept that you are perfect as you are, that there's no more you need to do, then you would not have to show up as the boastful person putting on this performance, because who you would be perfectly all that is required.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, you wouldn't have to be so invisible and self-deprecating to allow others to please themselves, to basically let them have their way, essentially, and give them everything they want, so that you're invisible. So you're either in their face or you're invisible, but both have the source of I'm not good enough.
And they're both a performance.
And they're both a performance, yeah.
Yes. In that middle lane, so then I immediately go to, okay, but well, then if I'm a super nice person and that's ego, or I'm just a jerk and that's ego, what's the middle lane? Where do I rest in that? And I want to go back to the feeling of grace. When you give somebody grace, there is such a neutral, accepting, non-attachment, emotional, sober feeling when you lend grace to somebody. And when I think of emotional sobriety, and I'm kind of trying this word on for a while to see how I feel about it and apply it to different situations to say, does it apply here? It's that emotional sobriety to me feels like grace. That's what it feels like. But again, I'm trying it on in different situations to make sure that, does it apply here?
You can see it in the language as well. And when people talk about like, I was being, or I am being this, or I am that, or one of the ways to think about it is to just start to relate to yourself as I am versus I am being, or I am that. you know, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm cold. Like, don't say any of those other things, just say I am. And if you can wrap your head around this, it's quite powerful, because the metaphor that comes to my mind is, you know, I've been invited to, you know, a campfire with a bunch of people that I don't know. But I know that the people there are of various backgrounds, and they're all very accomplished and successful in this metaphor. And what is the chatter that's going on in my mind about how I'm going to show up? You know, so I show up, I sit down, I'm late to the party. They've already kind of been talking. I'm the new person who showed up. Do I just show up in that metaphor and simply kind of rest into the moment and just be who I am? I don't have anything that I'm trying to angle. I'm not, you know, are we thinking about how should I dress? What should I look like? What will people think if I look like this? What car should I come up in? I mean, you know, all of this, we're in that identity ego trap in that moment, right? Versus just being able to come up, sit down, start a conversation from a place of real, raw and authentic truth, your truth, right?
Yeah.
Being who you are at the truest sense. And so you can see in that metaphor, someone might show up very bombastic and putting on the show, wanting to suck the oxygen out of the moment and have the light all on them. So that would be an example of ego identity. And then another could show up wanting to almost not be there, like don't want to, you know, oh, is there a seat for me? I'll just stand back here, right? And it's just like not wanting to assert themselves, because
Yes.
themself needs to remain hidden, right? And both again come from that lack of self-acceptance. Now, if someone is naturally an enthusiastic, extroverted person, I don't want to make the behavior wrong. I just want to be clear about that, right? Some people, that's who they really are. And there, it's perfect, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we often see way more people fronting, you know, fake it till you make it, you know, trying on behaviors
Yeah.
to try to win at this game. And I think we're in a place in human history right now with social media and the level of fakeness, I guess, going on right now, that authenticity, just real authenticity, stands out as really refreshing. I actually think that that some people are going to start cluing into this, and unfortunately they may try to game it, and so there's ego again showing up, right? It's just so subtle, it's always there. But I think we're in a new age of authenticity reigning in terms of standing out.
I think so. I hope
Yeah,
so. I mean, as a
yeah,
woman, I can see how in society how women are just morphing their bodies to these
yeah,
bizarre surgeries and adding this and taking away. I believe there's a time and a place for cosmetic surgery, but I don't believe that you should be plastic from head to toe. To me, that's a huge underlying issue.
yeah,
Huge underlying issue. You are not comfortable in your own skin. That's
yeah,
what it says to me, that you're looking for acceptance and you want to be attractive to men or your whatever your flavor is, women, if that's your thing, but you want to be attracted to the people that you're attracted to, and you think that adding cheeks and fixing your chin and adding some butt implants and maybe some breast implants, that's going to cause that person to be attracted to you.
yeah,
Okay, they may find that to be physical. Maybe some people are into that. I'm not, don't knock it till you try it, but I'm just saying. But once they start to get to know you past all of that, what are they going to see?
yeah,
Are you showing that part? Are you revealing that part? And then if you don't, and you end up in a long-term relationship with that person, do you really know who you're with? And so I can't speak from that experience directly. I don't know what that's like to have that need to let me, cosmetically change my body. I don't have that feeling. I don't know what that means. I'm saying
mm-hmm.
on this side of it, I can interpret it and say, this is what it communicates to me. Like I
Mm-hmm.
said, there's a time and place for cosmetic surgery. There are some things that, yes, absolutely. If you were that insecure about a body part that can be corrected with plastic surgery, by all means do so. But it becomes an addiction. And you see these people, men and women, have these addictions where they're constantly getting another plastic thing done, another plastic thing done. it's concerning. It's concerning to me.
Yeah. I don't know if she's still alive. There was a woman, she may still be alive. She was born with a rare genetic disorder where her body didn't build muscle and properly. And so like, I think she weighed like 80 pounds or something like that. Like she just couldn't build muscle in her body. It was a genetic thing. And so her face was very deformed because the muscle wouldn't build in her. And, there was really no plastic surgery that was going to help her anyway. And she's a very inspiring woman. She was on the Oprah Winfrey show many, many years
I
ago.
know who you're
I
talking
think you could
about.
like probably Google, she's been known as the ugliest woman in the world and like
Yeah.
awful things like this. And I watched the interview and it was one of the most profoundly powerful things because she had gotten to a place. She did a TED talk too, I think, actually, this woman. And she had gotten to a place where she was able to stand in the world and speak her truth and look people head on. And, and she had the most kindest heart, like you could just feel it. And she was like a walking, living, breathing example of how to attain a state of egolessness. And yeah, this is her. Yeah, what's her name again? Lizzie Velasquez. And so you see her picture, and at first you're startled because our brains are wired to look for human beings and faces that look a certain way, and so it's jarring when you first see her. But if you listen to her, you will realize what's possible in terms of attaining a level of ego management. Let's just call it that at the best. I'm sure she even has ego stuff going on, right? Because her ego stuff would show up as, oh, I'm ugly, I can't be seen. So it'd be that identity of taking on the identity of I'm not worthy, I'm not relevant, I shouldn't have a voice. That's ego, right? It doesn't seem like it is, but it is. And so, but she was able to tap into her authentic self, her authentic expression of herself. And she said, no, I need to be me. I need to show up in the world and speak my truth and speak from what's going on. And it inspired so many people. So you're talking about people who get addicted to plastic surgery for little tiny things. And then you look at a woman like this, who there was no plastic surgery that could help her, and her ability to stand in that and be true to herself and confidently and honestly speak and not worry about whether people were offended. People were offended by the way she looked. That's how ridiculous this is, right?
Yes.
And she's like, I'm not owning that. And so she speaks from the heart, and it's a really powerful talk. I encourage everyone to go find her TED talk or her Oprah Winfrey interview that was done. And because it's a perfect example of, these, like you're saying, September, the women or men who get really attached to plastic surgery. What if you looked like her? Could you get to that level of authenticity and the nobodiness state, right? And be just true to yourself? I mean, it's an interesting thing. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't get plastic surgery or whatever, but where are you coming from in it? Is your identity so wrapped up in it that you can't even stand to look at yourself in the mirror because you have a few extra wrinkles? Well, imagine if you were Lizzie. I mean, how does she get through the day? It's a different level of power. She's tapped into a very deep and profound level of power for her to be able to go out and to be herself authentically, despite how she looks.
There's stories coming out. There's a botched show on, I don't know, Netflix or something, about plastic surgeries that have gone wrong. And several of the stories that were in there, they had received these plastic surgeries young, like early 20s, late teens, and having it. And they regret it. I felt this way. Yeah, of course, there's certain things I don't like about my body. Like that's everybody. But there's a point where you just have to accept it. I'm human. This is what the human body does. But there's this, what's interesting in those stories that I like hearing is, I've learned to love myself. I've learned more about myself, and I realized I didn't need that. I was perfect. It's the way that I was. And now I've messed up my body because I was holding on to something then. I have one last question for you around this ego. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on how trauma relates to ego development or ego
Oh, well,
programming.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that actually the ego is so we all have an ego. We always will, right? We'll always have this sense of wanting to do, the ego is like I said, it's just identity. It's the way our authentic self relates to the identified self in terms of how we get along in the world and what we do. And so we all have one. And it needs to be managed in order for us to live a fully thriving life. Like I said, even Lizzie has to manage her ego because her ego could show up as, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not going to go out into the world and speak my truth. And so it's all related to trauma when it becomes dysfunctional, right? And trauma can show up, as we know, many great people are talking about it right now. Gabor Mate is probably one of the best known that's been really kind of shining a light on trauma. And incidentally, we can over talk about trauma and create a new trauma because we're so obsessed with trauma. Just to put that out there too.
Yes.
See, everything is this fine balance, right?
Sure.
It's like Jesus said, the way is narrow, right? It's narrow. The objective with emotional sobriety and everything that we teach in TMIC is to provide people with the tools and the framework to be able to walk that narrow path between the two extremes, between the two paradigms of extremes. And so, yes, trauma is the reason that we develop an unhealthy ego, that for whether that's the bombastic one or whether that's the hidden one and the people pleaser one, or anything in between there, is usually because something has happened to us. Sometimes it's not even something really that others would consider traumatic. Someone might have just said something to us when we were a kid, or insulted us, or it doesn't need to be trauma the way we often think of it. But anyway, and we determined, well, I'm not going to let that happen to me ever again. And therefore I need to change who I am. I need to change who I am. And there's the beginning of the identity to hide your authentic self so that that thing doesn't happen to you again. Right. And so I think all egos that are unhealthy and that are sort of running the show from a place of toxicity are the result of some trauma. And there's no human being on planet Earth that has not had trauma of some sort, because I tell this story all the time as an example of kind of trauma. It's a great example of the ego too. And it's a great example, just to wrap up, in terms of what happened and that I had to gain some awareness around. So when I was like 7 or 8 years old, it was my birthday. And we were at, I was having a birthday party with friends and everything like that. And it was, it was back when Star Wars was fresh and new. It was a big deal. And everyone was getting Star Wars toys and bed sheets and all the things, right? And I had tons of it already anyway. So this particular year, I was hopeful that I was going to get some more Star Wars toys or something, right? I can't remember exactly what year it was. I think it was like early 80s, 81, 82. Anyway, and so we're at my friend's house, and he had got a ton of Star Wars stuff for his birthday, which was, a little bit before mine. And so I was like, oh, I hope I get that stuff. Anyway, so my mom doesn't get me Star Wars stuff that year. She gets me a board game. It's the board game Sorry, which is actually quite a good board game.
It is.
And it's kind of ironic, right? It's like, hey, sorry, you're not getting Star Wars toys.
Exactly.
But anyway, so she gets me this board game. She doesn't even remember this story, by the way. I've told it to her since, and she's like, I don't even remember that happening. So this is my story of trauma. So I'm immediately traumatized because I had this attachment. So trauma and attachment's an interesting conversation we can get into. I had this attachment to what my birthday, how it was going to go down, and what I was going to get for a gift, and I didn't get it. And so I immediately had this traumatic experience as a child, right? What did I make it mean about me? I don't really remember, but I obviously made it mean that, I don't know, people don't love me, or People don't listen to me. I'm invisible. They don't hear what I want. Like, I don't know, right? I mean, the mind of a child is bizarre, and we were all children. So we all got stuff here. So anyway, I ran upstairs, had a whole temper tantrum, the whole thing, just like a child does. And then I was traumatized again by my own behavior, because I was like, oh, what an awful way to be to your mother. And like, you ungrateful little jerk, what, so I had this whole thing happening simultaneously to being pissed off that I didn't get my Star Wars stuff. And so in that moment, I didn't realize this till years later, incidentally, when I was doing my own sort of inner work, and I had this epiphany, like this pop one day. It was like, bang, this whole scene flashed before my eyes, because I was in the inquiry of the ego personality that was running my life, and I was very much a people pleaser. And it developed from this moment. From this moment is when I became a people pleaser, because I said in that moment that I felt so awful at how I had behaved with my mother and embarrassed her in front of all of the parents and the friends that were there and all that stuff, that I determined I would never do that again, ever, to anyone. And so immediately it became people pleaser. Immediately it became do whatever it takes to make people happy with you, so that you don't relive this experience where you made your mother so embarrassed in front of all these people. And for 20 some years, until I realized this, it was many years ago now, but for 20 some years, that ran my life. Everything I did, it was subconscious, but everything I did was deferring to what other people wanted first. And because that was my programming for so many years, that's what was starting to sneak in to what we were doing here with TMIC. Don't ask too much of them. People please.
Yes.
Don't be a demand on them. And what hit me was, no, as a leader, I'm not a demand on them. The vision is a demand on them. The vision requires these things. Without these things, the vision cannot manifest. And the role of any leader is simply to manage your ego as best you can. So this was an example of ego management. I was able to get away for a while, reflect, look at what was going on, and see the ego was popping up again. And I course corrected immediately as soon as I saw that, as soon as I got back. And it's been great ever since we've course corrected, because people are like, okay. So, but that's how it can sneak up. And so my ego shows up as people pleasing, not wanting to offend people, not wanting to disappoint people, was actually the exact phrase that hit me that day. I will never disappoint someone again. And so for me in my life, the more I try to not disappoint people, historically, the more I've disappointed people. It's a weird conundrum.
Ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. Why? Because the authentic me is not showing up, so they're disappointed. Yeah. Because they see something in me that I'm not letting out. Yeah. And they're like, this guy should be doing this, what's going on here?
Yes.
Right? So, but I'm not wanting to disappoint them. So I'm keeping that hidden, I'm blocking it, and I'm presenting an ego identity, which is not me. It's fake. Right? So I don't know what else I can say about it. It's a big conversation, and yes, it's all tied back to some trauma. So that was my trauma story.
I think we could probably talk about the ego for several more hours.
Yeah.
So here's the last question as we close. Having this conversation is a new conversation for somebody, and they want to take action, or they want to change this in their life. What step do they take?
Well, a step that they could take in their own life right now is to reflect on a time, and you might have to sit for a minute and see if one pops up, but to reflect on a time where you internally felt that you wanted to say or do something, and you either held back, or the way you did it was like over the top, right? Think of a time where You authentically had a feeling of this is what I want to say or what I want to do, and how what came out was not congruent with that. And then just ask yourself, what's kind of going on underneath the surface of all of that. Look at your life and realize that everything in your life is a result of your choices, your decisions. And start to try to take responsibility for the fact that since those are all your decisions and your choices, if there's anything that doesn't align with you, if there's anything that is not giving you life, if there's anything that is detracting from you feeling fully alive, that you have the power to do something about that. But in order to start to work at that, you're going to need to address this thing called ego, because the identity that you've been putting out there is what has manifested and brought all of that into your existence. So it starts with awareness. And so this little exercise of thinking of a time when you wanted to show up or say or do something, but either didn't felt worthy or overdid it, and try to tap into what was underneath all of that. And then obviously, I would encourage everyone to look at what we're doing at TMIC with our different workshops, the whole life architecture. I mean, we deal with these things over the course of the entire year of the whole life architecture program when people go through it, so that the person you enter in as is not the person you leave as. The person you leave as is the person you design and create for yourself. Most of us are living a life by default right now. It's a life that we've inherited because through our conditioning of our friends, family, and our community, it's by default. And our subconscious mind was programmed as a young child to interpret life this way, to react to life this way, to only see life this way. And yet, if you're on track, if you're totally at peace and joyful and content with your life. And if you're not, and some people try to convince themselves that they are, but you're not, because late at night it's dogging at you. If you're not, then that means you're out of alignment with your life, and so you're living a life by default. It's not who you really authentically are. But there's no single practice that's going to solve the ego problem. This is sort of awareness, behavior correction, and you have to kind of rebuild yourself over time.
I think the ego is something that is a companion of ours while we're here in this realm. And it's something to have a healthy relationship with.
Yeah, we should. Yeah. It's it is our identity. The question is your identity authentic, or is it manufactured and fabricated? And is it orientating itself so that you're bending to the world, right? Again, it comes back to that. Either we're bending to the world or the world is bending to us. And for most people, we're bending to the world, and we're in ego whenever we're bending to the world, because we're sacrificing our authentic expression of ourself for some perceived thing outside of ourself that we feel we need to bend and contort ourselves into to be accepted, to be seen, to be loved. And that all starts with the inner chatter that we're not acceptable, we shouldn't be seen, and we're unlovable. And that's when we're coming from those places, that's when we allow the ego to run the show. You're unlovable. You sit in the background. Let me show you how it's done. Right?
Yes.
So it's a mask. It's like a costume. It's like Ram Dass said, it's our spacesuit.
Yes, it is our Earth spacesuit.
Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation, Chad. This was very, very insightful.
Yeah, I feel like we're just getting started with it. It's one of these things that you can sit around and talk about for hours, because there's so many ways to it's like a prism. There's so many ways to get at it. But once you start to get at it enough ways, it starts to become really, really clear. So for all of our listeners and viewers, I'd encourage you to, try on that little practice. And if you want help with it, well, that's what we're here to do. So, check out the Whole Life Architecture program and see if it's a fit for you. But that will conclude this episode of the Most Important Conversations on Ego. And September, always great chatting with you. And I look forward to having our next conversation very soon.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.
That concludes this episode of the Most Important Conversations. This in-depth conversation could set you on the path to self-improvement, which is essential if you want to be an effective leader and take meaningful action in your life. If you enjoyed this episode and want more of these stimulating discussions, you can find them at TMICglobal.com. Remember, the world is at a crossroads right now. You can't afford to waste this opportunity to take charge of your life, build meaningful relationships with others, and co-create a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.